A new feature in version 2 of our character controllers is the ability to pick up items at runtime. This is especially useful for RPGs where you have a whole bunch of different items, but you don't necessarily want to assign them all to the character at edit time. For this video, make sure you've first seen the item types and the items video. It would also help to watch the melee weapon setup video, because for this video I'm going to be creating a sword, and in that melee weapon video it goes through the setup process for the sword. So let's begin by first opening up the item manager, and we can do that through this menu, and we'll drag it in, and the name of the item that we're creating is sword. The item type is sword. And we're going to leave this character field blank because we're not assigning the item to a character initially. Slot ID specifies the parent item slot component that we should assign the sword to in this case. And because we want to assign the sword to the right hand, we're going to look at the right hand, and underneath it, it has this item slot component that has an ID of 0. Notice the left hand has an item slot ID of 1. And there's a similar setup for the third person hand as well. So here's the third person left hand and the third person right hand. So we want the slot ID to be 0, and then it has a unique animator ID of 22. We're going to leave the base object field blank for first person because it's going to assign it to the first person arms. We're then going to assign the model file, and it's not called model, it's called sword. The sword will not have an animator controller, and we're going to set up a similar sword item for the third person view. So the next thing that the last thing that we need to assign is the melee action type, and now we can hit build. Instead of assigning it to the character now, it saves it out to a prefab, and so that looks good. Except now we really have no way to have the character actually pick up the sword, so we need to create an item pickup trigger. And we can do that through this object manager. The game object will be the visible game object, which will just have the sword so you can visually see what you're picking up. Now the sword pickup has been created. Let's drag it in. And the last thing that we need to do is assign this pickup set so it knows what it's picking up, and we want to pick up the sword prefab that we just created. Notice it would automatically fills in the slot ID, and then we need to specify that one sword should be picked up. So you could have just the item being picked up but not actually equipped or added to the inventory if I left this item type count blank. But let's go ahead and hit play. And now when I run into the trigger with the character, we should see him equipping the sword. And watch this items game object, because right now there's nothing underneath it. But when I run into it, now the sword got added. So it was added at runtime. The equip had some issues. It wasn't like he didn't equip it starting far enough down, but that's alright. That can be adjusted later. That's actually in the melee weapon setup video. The other issue that we have that's related more to the runtime pickup is when the sword gets spawned, it's spawned in the wrong position, and we will want to adjust this position using the transform tools. And instead of going through and trying to figure out the precise value, I have this value saved. So that looks good. Now what we want to do is lock this inspector, and then we want to open up another inspector. So now what we can do is, we'll get that over here, is we'll click on the sword game object, or the sword prefab that we created, and we'll scroll down to the first person perspective item, and this local spawn position and local spawn rotation corresponds to these values right here, or it should correspond to. So I'm just going to copy these values in, and then once the sword spawns after being picked up, after I replay this, it should spawn in the correct position. I'm going to do something similar for a third person since it has the same values. So I'm just copying the values over. And then once I get done with this, I should be at the same spot that I was at if I didn't have runtime pickup. So Now that looks good. Exit out of this. And now we'll notice that sword, if I scroll down, it kept these values, so the local spawn position and rotation was set. So now when I run into the sword, it should be spawned in the hand correctly. So that looks good. Let's switch to third person as well. So yeah, third person looks good as well. Now we can start configuring the sword like normal, and all the configuration would be done on the actual sword prefab. So for example, if you wanted to set the position offset, you'd set that here. The one last thing related to the first person perspective item for spawning the object is this base object ID. Because we only had one set of hands, or one set of arms for first person, it could be left at 0. But if you had multiple set of arms, this ID corresponds to the same value of this first person base object ID. So that's just if you had a whole bunch of different arms and you wanted to spawn it under a different set of arms rather than the default. But other than that, that's all that it takes in order to set up an item for runtime pickup.